Och 3 telefoner med abonnemang, 2 skärmar och 2 diskmaskiner.
Och något mer?
Vadå mer?
Ja, så finns det något mer jag kan köpa?
Tror du har allt?
Inte ens en...
Jag är faktiskt rätt säker.
Ja, jag fattar. Jag ska kila vidare. Vänta, är det där en kaffemaskin?
Elgiganten Företag. Hjälpen du vill ha, inte bara behöver.
Upptäck Ford e-Custom, elversionen av Europas mest sålda transportbil. Den har upp till 370 kilometers räckvidd, snabbladdning och finns nu med 4-hjulsdrift. Just nu till Ford Pro Edition-pris från 479 000 ex-moms. Läs mer på Ford.se eller besök din Ford-återförsäljare. Ready, set, Ford.
Get ready Sweden. BetMGM är här. Nu kan du uppleva spänningen från Las Vegas i mobilen. Ta chansen att spela på Bellagio roulettebord eller våra exklusiva MGM-slots. BetMGM. Casino och sport i mobilen. Åldersgräns 18 år. Regler och villkor gäller.
Today I'm speaking with Jonathan Freedland. He's a columnist at The Guardian. He hosts the podcast Unholy together with Jonathan Levi, which has been especially enlightening these last few weeks after the massacre perpetrated by Hamas in Israel. He's also the author of many books, of which his latest is called The Escape Artist, the man who broke out of Auschwitz to warn the world. And it came out in 2022, and it's now been translated into Swedish by Volante förlag with the title Det första vittnet, mannen som flydde från Auschwitz. And I got the opportunity to sit down and talk to Jonathan at the newly opened Holocaust Museum in Stockholm to talk to him about this book. And I have to say it's a remarkable book about a remarkable man. Rudolf Vrba became one of the first Jews to escape from Auschwitz and make his way to freedom among maybe 5 to 10 who ever pulled off that near impossible feat. And he did it to reveal the truth of the death camp to the world and to warn the last Jews of Europe what fate awaited them. And against all odds, Vrba and his fellow escapee Fred Wetzler, they climbed mountains, crossed rivers, and narrowly escaped German bullets until they had smuggled out the first full account of Auschwitz the world had ever seen. And it was a detailed report that eventually reached Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and the Pope. And even though they got the information what was going on, too few heeded the warning, and he had risked everything. And so even though his report helped save maybe 200,000 Jewish lives, especially in Budapest, he never stopped believing he could have saved so many more, and that he always was bitter to the end that people didn't listen to him. And I have to say, this is one of the most thrilling books I've read, with all the ingredients of a really good adventure story as well. But of course, the backdrop is so horrific and it's so unbelievably awful. And at times, the details are just pure evil, pure sadism. So it's really a story on many levels. And I highly recommend this book, not only because it's masterfully written, but because I agree with Jonathan Freedland that Rudolf Vrba deserves to be remembered alongside Anne Frank, Oskar Schindler, and Primo Levi as someone who defines our understanding of the Holocaust. But now on to today's guest. You're listening to Rak Höger with me, Ivar Arpi. Welcome, Jonathan Freedland, to Rak Höger.
Very good to be with you.
And I came across your book, The Escape Artist, when it came out in English, and I must acknowledge that of course, I know about the Holocaust. You learn about it in school, and I have many Jewish friends, and it's like a subject that comes up in many when you study at the university. But the main character of your book, the escape artist, Rudolf Vrba, I hadn't heard about him. And I realized when I read the book that I had seen him in the documentary by Landsman, Shoah, but I didn't remember him. So it was when I read your book that I realized that this is why haven't I heard about this? Because it's one of the most extraordinary and harrowing tales that I've ever come across. I mean, how did you learn about him, and why did you decide to write about him?
Well, first of all, you're not alone in not having heard of him. In fact, when I decided to write the book, I did a kind of market testing because I wanted to see if this was a story that would be new to people. And as a writer, I was delighted that hardly anybody had heard of him. But as somebody who wants the memory of the Holocaust to live on, in a way, it was very saddening to think this man's extraordinary heroism had been forgotten, and that he had almost been written out of history. But I tried it out on different people, this name, even people who were well steeped in and knowledgeable about the Holocaust. I would say, who is Rudolf Vrba? And they would say, sorry, I can't place that name. One or two people, Sir Simon Sharma, very eminent historian, he knew the name, a couple of others, but mainly people didn't. And so in terms of just, an author of a book that you want people to read and that will seem new, I was gratified because I thought, okay, that means I'm telling a story that is not too familiar. But as I say, it seemed to me there was a wrong there that needed to be righted, that his story needed to be better known. In terms of where I came across it, it was, as you've mentioned, this extraordinary film, this 9.5-hour documentary about the Holocaust, Shoah, by Claude Lanzmann. It came out in 1985. I saw it the following year, actually, when I was 19, which means if your audience are doing the mental arithmetic, I can save you that trouble. I'm 56. Yeah. And I was 19 years old. I was sitting in the cinema. The film is a very unusual one, as you know, because you've seen it, which is that it's no archive footage. There's no black and white photo pictures. It's just interviews with living witnesses and survivors of the Nazi murder of 6 million Jews.
And also, I mean, survivors. What's so extraordinary with that documentary is also that he tricks perpetrators and guards and to to tell him stuff that they would have never admitted to.
That's right.
And he gets that recorded.
And you realise now, with sort of hidden cameras and everything, and you realise now that is so rare. There's almost no perpetrator testimony on film like that. But he was determined to do it, and you actually see him, don't you? You see him lying. Yeah. At one point, one of them says, "This is not on camera, is it?" He goes, "No, of course not." And we're watching it, but all in a good cause kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's an amazing film. But most of the film is made up of this procession of very old, to my 19-year-old eye back then, old, grey, often sort of broken men. And then suddenly, exploding onto the screen, comes this charismatic, English-speaking, tanned man with this head of thick, dark hair, who speaks English and is doing it in New York City, where everyone else has been in the kind of flat forests of Poland or in Russia and speaking Russian or German. Suddenly he's speaking heavily accented English. The Twin Towers are behind him because the interview was done in the 70s, and you sit upright watching it, thinking this man has got almost movie star charisma. and he's wearing this tan leather coat. He kind of looks like Al Pacino in a 70s movie, Scarface or something. And almost as an aside, it's not actually the focus of what Landsman wants to talk about. Landsman mentions that this guy, Rudolf Vrba, had escaped from Auschwitz. And I'm sitting there in the cinema, age 19, and I think, I don't know a huge amount about the Holocaust, but I do know that Jews basically did not escape from Auschwitz. That it was probably the most severe form of incarceration there has ever been, to be a Jew in Auschwitz. Nobody. How could this guy have escaped from there? I'm sat there thinking. As I say, the film doesn't really do much about that. But the name stayed with me, the face stayed with me, the story stayed with me for years and years, decades. I didn't forget the name. I thought Rudolf Vrba, the guy who escaped from Auschwitz. And I looked up a few things about him. And then in more recent years, I found myself coming back to that story. And partly around certain developments we might talk about, I found myself thinking, now is the time to tell that story.
Yeah, and when I've spoken about your book to people, and I've said just that he was one of the select few, 5 Jews in total, I think you say, escaped from Auschwitz. And people often say, no, it must have been much more, because there's a sense that there were people who escaped Auschwitz. And of course, there was, you say, but the Jews were kept in a much tighter security. So the people who escaped were Polish resistance or Russian prisoners of war, but not Jews. And many tried but failed.
That's right. It's hard to be absolutely exact about the figures because there are some individual cases there. It's very hard to classify exactly what happened with them and whether it sort of counts. It's certainly no more than 10. It's maybe 5, it's maybe 7. It depends exactly how you count it. When Rudolf Vrba himself and Fred Wetzler, his companion, partner, friend in escape, when they did it in April 1944, at that point, no Jew had ever, to their knowledge, escaped from Auschwitz and lived to tell the tale without the assistance of somebody from the inside, in other words, an SS man. So no one had done what they, as far as they knew, what they were attempting to do. As you say, there were escapes by Soviet prisoners of war, political prisoners from Poland, because the regime on them was much less severe. And there were, it was still severe, they were in Auschwitz, but there was scope for escaping, and the figures suggest, scores, over 100, I think, Polish prisoners escaped. With Jews, you can count them on the fingers, I think probably of one hand, maximum on 2 hands, depending again exactly how you count it, and who counts and who doesn't, which is, people argue about those things. But it's a vanishingly small category, and yet he pulled it off.
Yeah, in the way, the escape itself. If you just take the way they planned it, the way he learned what you called escapology, like the art of escaping and all that. If you just take that part, it's sort of an adventure movie. It's one of the best scripts for an adventure movie. And then you realize it's about the Holocaust. So you can't have like a cheerful, like funny slapstick or like a comic relief sort of movie. But if you just take that part, it's so intense and exciting. But when he arrives, and he's one of the some people might not remember or have learned, but there's most of the Jews coming to Auschwitz are immediately put to death, but there are a few selected and to work basically as slave labor for German companies and assist in the death machine or industry that is the death camp. And he's one of the people who is selected to work. And so he has a front row seat, sounds callous, but he sees all these scenes of people coming from all over, Jews from all over Europe, and he sees what's happening. And but what is like? He's only 17 when he's taken into the camps, and what is his? He has a realization, and that realization leads to. He says in Shoah in the documentary that if I would just escape if it was just an escape movie for his own sake, I mean that's a good reason to escape, to survive. But he has another reason for it. But what does he come to realize, this young man?
Well, first of all, thank you for what you said about the escape story, because I think that too, that it is just the most thrilling escape. And I think anyone who grew up like I did with those sort of World War II stories, especially perhaps men, you've seen quite a few escape movies, one way or another. To my mind, and obviously I'm biased, but I do think it is the most thrilling escape story of all of them, because it is the hardest to be a Jew in Auschwitz. So I'm glad you felt that. And in a way, that was part of the point, was to make it feel and read like an adventure and escape story, because it is. But it has this other, much more, grave import as well, because of the purpose. And you're quite right that he's there, age 17 he arrives at Auschwitz. He is a slave. He's one of that 5 or 10%, exactly as you say, who is, when each of these trains arrives, the life expectancy of a Jew in Auschwitz is measured in hours. The overwhelming majority of every Jew on those trains is sent straight away to the gas chambers. But Rudy's estimate was 5-10% were taken off and sent to work. Really, it's another form of death sentence. It's annihilation through labor, is what the SS called it. And you are sent as a slave laborer. And he was bounced around various areas, carrying some bags of cement on his back, building a factory, or digging in gravel pits. And then eventually he finds himself on the Alte Judenrampe, the old Jew ramp, the SS called it, which is a railway platform where all of these trains are coming in every day, sometimes up to 5 a day, often at night, under bright electric light. One witness said it was as if it was noon, even in the middle of the night, so bright with these searchlights that would be trained on, almost like a movie set, on the railway platform. And his job was to get people off and get their stuff off their bags immediately. One of the things he would always talk about was that people underplay the extent to which this was an economic operation. The Nazis wanted to not just kill the Jews, but rip them off, take everything they had. So his job was getting those suitcases off so they'd all be piled up and taken away. And
they have, of course, taken with them many valuables to maybe bribe them, able to bribe themselves to a better situation. Or
that's right. So their possessions, in fact, this had been his job before, in an area that became nicknamed Canada, because Canada, in the Central European imagination of that period, was seen as a land of plenty where the streets were paved with gold. So this area where all the stuff was collected did include, yes, pots and pans and bedding and children's toys, but also sometimes hidden in the hem of a garment would be diamonds, or a roll of dollar bills that would have been secreted inside a toothpaste tube, because people did think this was money they might need to save their own lives, or to bribe themselves, as you say, into a better situation. But the thing that when he was working on that ramp, he actually witnessed this process of selection night after night. Most sent to the left where they were sent to gas chambers, some sent to the right where they would be given, the uniform of a prisoner, the famous tattoo with the number on their uniform to correspond to that particular transport, that particular train they were on, have their hair shaved and so on. But one important realization dawned on Rudy as he was working night after night, really doing traumatic work. I mean, to see families wrenched apart night after night as he was seeing. He was very struck by the fact that everyone who got off this train would line up in pretty orderly, calm fashion. And that was because, he soon understood, not one of them had any idea where they were. They did not know that they had arrived at a place that was organized for their murder. They all thought they were here to start a new life, that a new, admittedly relocated Jewish community was going to be formed. That's why they'd brought the pots and pans and children's textbooks and exercise books. They thought, this is not what we would have chosen. We've been deported from our homes, but we have to make the best of it and start a new life. And they thought that because they had been told that every step of the way. And Rudy understood quite quickly, and I think with tremendously sort of penetrating insight. By now he's about 18. And I don't think others older than him had sort of, understood with such clarity that this was a method. The Nazis needed the Jews to proceed through the system in a calm, orderly fashion, because if they didn't, if there was panic and they started stampeding and running and rushing, that would break down the whole system. As he would say in an interview later on, it's much easier to kill sheep than to hunt deer.
Yeah.
Meaning, if your victims are proceeding in neat columns into the slaughterhouse, you can control that.
Yeah.
If they're running on the hillsides and you have to pick them off with machine guns, that's slow and inefficient.
And a few percentage points of the people might even get away.
Which you didn't want, because even one person might get away and then tell others. And you need your victims to be ignorant. And the ignorance was not just a side thing. I, like a lot of people, probably grew up with knowledge that, for example, the Nazis always said that the gas chambers were showers.
Yeah.
I think that people know that they were told they were getting a shower. That is just one of a whole series of lies that were told so that the victims would be completely in the dark as to their fate, and would proceed in this orderly and calm fashion. That deception was central. I give in the book all kinds of examples how they would get their victims to write letters back home under duress saying everything here is good, everything is fine. They would tell the victims as they arrived, remember, just on the threshold of the gas chambers, they would say, tie your shoes together left and right, so that afterwards, after you've had your shower, you'll be able to find both of your shoes. They would ask each person what their professional trade was, and someone would say, I'm a mechanic. Good, we need mechanics. See me afterwards, they would say. At every stage, they would be lied to so that they would be compliant. And 18-year-old Rudolf Vrba, standing on the railway platform, thinks this system relies on the ignorance of its victims. The only way this killing machine is going to be slowed down, I'm not saying stopped, but just slowed down, is if these victims are no longer ignorant. Somebody has to tell them what fate awaits them at the end of that railway line. And with the wonderful arrogance of youth, aged 18, he thinks that someone might as well be me.
Yeah, and as you said, and as you write, he worked at the old, the Alten Judenramp, and now they're going to process the Hungarian Jews, and they're a lot of them, and so they've come to realize this old ramp that they've reinforced with concrete will not do. We're going to have to push the pace if we're going to do this, and we're going to have to bring in more trains. We're going to build the railroad tracks all the way up to the gas chambers, and so he realizes, like, when this is finished, it will commence. So he has sort of he's working against the clock, really.
Yeah, that's exactly right. He always, from the start, as you said about him being an escapologist, he was itching to escape from the very beginning. He tried twice already, long before he got to Auschwitz. I describe all that in the book. So he wanted to escape anyway, but now he had a purpose, which was in order to warn the last Jews of Europe what awaited them. And now, finally, he absolutely has a deadline, which is an urgency to do it now, because word gets around the camp that they are waiting for the next group, which is the Hungarian Jews, as you say, some 800,000, maybe even more on some estimates. The last whole Jewish community of Europe that has been as yet untouched. And the rumour goes around that they're next. And as you say, they are building this extension of the railway line, a spur that will make the process so much more efficient because the victims will be taken to the very doors of the gas chamber. He sees all that and thinks, I've got to go now. But one thing that's, in addition to this resolve, is he realises very early on that he has to not just, if he's going to do this, he cannot just tell the outside world, look, they're killing lots of people there. He almost, I think, realizes as a young man, people would be skeptical of believing him. He decides he has to accumulate the evidence, and by that, the actual data of death. And he commits to memorizing every single transport that he witnesses that comes into the camp. And by that I mean the number of cattle cars, the number of wagons on each train, how many are in each train, he makes an estimate, the point of origin, the date, and the numbers that are allocated to that transport in terms of those prisoners when they come off. The ones who are selected for work, they have a number tattooed on their arm that corresponds to that transport. In an extraordinary feat of memory. I mean, really a freakish memory that Vrba has.
And those numbers correspond also to the place of origin of the Jews arriving.
That's right.
And as a Swede, we have a social security number, and so you know the gender. Like it corresponds. I mean, it's not the same.
Yes.
But I have 4 kids, and to just memorize their social security numbers has been kind of hard. It's four people,
right.
And my wife, so 5 people.
And you remember those, and it takes you a lot to do it.
Yeah, it takes a lot of. It takes a feat of my memory to I think I'm pretty proud of myself that I could memorize them, and he memorizes
hundreds. Yeah, hundreds of transports with those corresponding serial numbers, and it's not just one number per transport, by the way, because it's a range. Because what he'll remember is the number or the first number and then the last number of the prisoners who were on that transport. So he'll remember 88500 to 88750, say, and he'll remember that for each of hundreds of transports, and he stores it in his head. He later explained that he used the technique of like a child's memory game. The game when you say, I went to market, I had a basket, a tomato and a melon. The next day I went to market, I had a basket, a tomato, a melon, and a camera. He would add each day the newest transport on top of all the other ones that he would have to keep saying again and again in his head until he had hundreds of these. And there were sometimes 5 a night, and he would remember them all. I did toy with calling this book The Memory Man, because it is such a feat that he managed to do that. So he had this data in his head. He now had the resolve and determination to escape. And then it was a matter of finding a partner. I think he understood you couldn't do this alone. And with again, great emotional intelligence, I think. His instinct was that he combined with someone where trust was total, because they were both from the same small town in Slovakia. They were from Trnava, which I think is significant because they knew each other before Auschwitz. Yeah. And I think from everything I've read and understood, Auschwitz was this sort of morally inverted universe, where day was night and good was evil and evil was good in terms of the SS moral universe. Yeah. And it meant that even if you felt somebody was your ally, a fellow prisoner you could totally trust, you could never be completely sure that who this person was. But his partner, Alfred Wetzler, his friend, he knew him before they'd gone into this morally inverted universe, and therefore could decide this is someone I can trust.
And also, they were I think you mentioned there were 600 of them who came from that village, and they were the only 2 people left. So maybe there's a part of that they knew that they were for each other the only portal to the past or to that universe,
Yes.
that shared universe. So maybe that's a sort of another. You knew them from before, but it's also this is the link.
Yeah.
So you have your own interest. If I'm going to talk about the past, this is the guy.
Yeah. And they did. That was a sort of bond between them, that they had been at this same place, and they were. That's right. Of the 600 who had come to Auschwitz, men, Jewish men from Ternova, they were the last 2 left. So they made this plan, and I won't say exactly how it's done because I want people to read the book, but it's so ingenious. And again, it Rudy would go on to become a scientist. There's some of that in it. Required amazing physical bravery. And it did also require this rather ingenious insight, which was to realize that he had sort of spotted a gap in the Nazi defences, and it wasn't a literal gap. It wasn't a physical, there wasn't a hole in a fence or something. But he understood there was a weakness, and rather brilliantly, it was something that the SS would have taken pride in, which was the very predictability of their own
machine-like
routines and protocols. Yeah. He and Fred Wetzler and a couple of other prisoners who helped them had realised you could use that against them. And so that's how they got out.
It's basically the most morbid computer game ever, where you realize the computer has a pattern and you can outsmart it if you just wait there, do that, but there's no bright colors in this computer game, and it's not a computer game. But then they escape and they have to cross sort of marshes, forests, and they can only travel at night, and they haven't got. After a while, they haven't got any overcoats or no food left, and they have to get out of Poland. The goal is to get to Slovakia, and this is also part of the memory feat. Is that he had a kid's map, a children's map, for a few minutes, and he memorized the map. How he would if he's going to escape, which route to take. To Slovakia, which is his native country. So if he speaks in Poland, people will realize he has an accent and he's probably an escapee. But if he comes to Slovakia, it will be much harder to detect him because he has it's his native language.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, all of this goes to this point, which was that they had been warned in a way, once you've escaped Auschwitz, then your troubles begin. Yeah. Obviously that's the hardest thing you think of, but they found themselves now in Nazi-occupied Poland, 2 Jews on the run. I mean, that is so impossible. And later Rudy would say we were outside the camp with no map, no compass, no friends. And that's so important because if you're a Polish prisoner or a Soviet prisoner, there were networks of help on the outside, underground resistance. The Jews were alone. And there was every chance you could run into a collaborator, you could run into some resistance groups that were also anti-Semitic, you could run into ethnic Germans, you could run into the SS. They were all over. And that's why, exactly as you say, they had to move at night, they had to forage for food. One of the tips they'd been given was never accept any money, because if you have money, you will then have the urge to spend it. And
You'll be tempted.
You'll be tempted, and that will take you into a village, and then you'll be seen. So it was so improbable that they would be able to do this, and they had to, in exactly the way you say, they go through the forests and frozen rivers and find their way to that Slovak border. Somehow they do it. I mean, it's an incredible sort of adventure story in its own right, really. And they make it until eventually they make contact with the remnant Jewish community of Slovakia, because most had been deported to their deaths, but there was a small group who had managed to evade deportation, and they clung on. And they're in the basement of a Jewish old people's home, an old folks' home in the small town of Žilina. And I've stood in that basement. They sat there for the best part of 2 weeks where they were debriefed, really. Out of them poured everything they'd remembered. Particularly Rudy suddenly now dictates all of those transports he'd memorized, kept in his head. The man who takes it down is a Jewish community leader, middle-aged man, who later says this man, he was struck by this wonderful memory this man had. He couldn't quite believe such a person. And out of that...
just have to add that it's not like there's... you can boast about certain things, but they check, it's maybe later, but they check because they have the lists of the Jews that's been sent to Auschwitz. So they can actually check if it's and they have the pictures of the people, and so they can check if is it correct. Is he remembering correctly?
Correct. No, it wasn't later. It was exactly then. You're right. They did wonder, can we trust these two?
He's a 19-year-old.
He's a 19-year-old guy who looks looks like, probably now we would think he looks ravaged, and the feet have got these abscesses and sores. They haven't eaten properly. They probably looked infected, and he's coming up with all this information. They think, well, how do we know he's not deranged and just rambling? And he was able to start talking about specific transports that had left Slovakia because he'd memorized them, and say the date. And he was then even able to name individuals who had been on them because he remembered certain prisoners. And he would say this, Esther Klein was on this transport.
Vi på Fortum gör allt det där med elen enkelt och tryggt. Med vår smarta app har du alltid full koll, vare sig det handlar om din elanvändning eller morgondagens elpriser. Så byt till Fortum, Nordens mest valda elbolag. Upptäck kraften i Nordisk Energi.
Det är festivalsäsong och det betyder massor av lera. Så Alex surfade in på Amazon för att hitta ett tält som rymmer upp till 5 torra vänner, en mysig campingsäng, skön, och leopardmönstrade gummistövlar. Miau! Nu får Alex hantera precis lagom mycket lera för att vara Alex, vilket är betydligt mindre lera än för den där leriga dansande mannen där borta. Men vänta, har han bara lera på sig? Japp, bara lera. Håll dig torr, får det att hända. Hitta det på amazon.se.
Tänk om din plånbok kunde prata. Vad skulle den då säga om din relation till ekonomi?
Alla relationer har ju sina ups and downs. Men att han har lån lite här och där, det tror jag skulle vara en ick för rätt många plånböcker och inte bara för mig.
Ett första steg mot en bättre relation till sin plånbok kan vara att samla sina lån.
Samla dina lån till ett på lendo.se.
From this place in Slovakia, and they had, as you say, the Jewish community had kept a sort of card index system because this is part, perhaps we'll come on to this, but it had fallen to the Jewish community to organize. The Nazis did this, where they gave, with a sort of gun to the head of the Jewish community, would say, we're going to do a deportation tomorrow. Either you do it or we do it. And if you do it, you'll do it nicely, and we'll do it, cruelly. So it's up to you. And that they had therefore done the process, and they had the lists and the ID cards and everything that Rudy and Fred said checked out, and they thought these guys are telling the truth. And if you imagine what that encounter would have been like, where you are suddenly confronted, you're a Jew in Slovakia, you are being told that everybody who's left, your fellow community members, your family members, well, they were gassed to death. They're not coming back. And actually, that's not just true of the Jews of Slovakia. That's true of the Jews of Holland, France, Belgium, Poland, Greece. You are realizing, sitting in that basement room, that the Jews of Europe are being gassed and burnt 100 kilometers or so away, and most of them are already dead. I mean, I do often wonder, what would that encounter have been like for the people receiving the news, let alone Fred and Rudy giving it. But they check it out, they test it and test it again. They interviewed them separately because they were worried that the two men might, have concocted a story together. So they made sure they interrogated them separately. Lawyers came in. They really wanted to be sure it was true. But they were once convinced. It was typed up into a 32-page single-spaced report, which is just packed with dates, times and numbers of murdered Jews. And everything we now know about Auschwitz is basically in there. I mean, you realise that this was the first full account of what was happening in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and in some ways it still holds up as an account. So we know there about the tattoos, we know about the hair shaving, we know about the gold extracted from the teeth of the victims, we know about the method of gassing, we know the fate of those who tried to escape. It's all in there. It doesn't read very well. It's written very dryly. I think once you read it, you realise it was an engineer who took this down. There's no narrative or sort of storytelling, but it becomes a comprehensive account, a detailed account, and the first full account of the murder machine that existed in Auschwitz. And it's there in that document. And in a way, Rudy and Fred have done what they were desperate to do. They've warned the world as they see it. And now that document has to embark on its own journey. And it almost becomes in the book a sort of character. It now goes off past hand to hand across borders through, resistance figures, dissidents, church leaders, the odd journalist, the odd, maverick diplomat. Because we now think, I think, in our world where you just press one button and it's on
mass
social.
communication is
mass
very
communication.
easy.
Then somebody had to sit at a typewriter and type each individual copy. If you wanted a translation, somebody had to sit in an attic, and I describe this in the book, by hand, making sure no one ever came in, translating it. It took a long time to get this word out.
And as one of the scenes from the book, just to you give it some flesh here, is also that the woman who translates it into Hungarian, the wind takes one of the pages and it blows the drawing of Auschwitz, because they had drawn the basic outline of Auschwitz-Birkenau out from memory.
Yeah.
And so she's copying that, and that page is blown away, and it hits the fence, and a German Nazi walks by and picks it up. And if he, as you say in the book, if he had just looked at the page and seen, like, what is this? This is, so he had immediately would have realized that something is up, and the jig is up, basically.
Yeah.
But he doesn't look at the page. He just hands it over politely and smiles and walks on.
Yeah.
And it's just, there are so many times where it could have failed, but it didn't. But then the report reaches the top of, that it reaches Winston Churchill, it reaches Franklin D. Roosevelt, but it also reaches the Hungarian, the top of the Hungarian Jewish organization that's still there. And what happens then? Because this is something that later haunts Rudy.
That's right. I mean, just to sort of fill in on Roosevelt and Churchill, they get it. By now, Jewish leaders have attached a plea to the report saying, this is a factory of death. The railway tracks are the conveyor belt, bringing people in, bomb the railway tracks. And there's discussion in London and Washington, and they don't. And
Churchill says, like, to Anthony, do this, don't even discuss it, just put my name on it, like, this is we don't need to discuss it, just do it. But it ends up they don't do it because their main objective is to defeat the Nazis, and that will be the best for the Jews anyway.
That's
it's
right.
Basically the line of argument.
That's basically the line. The Air Ministry in London says, we can't do this because we bomb at night. This requires day. Try the Americans. The Americans, it gets passed, shuffled paper, desk to desk. Maybe let's discuss this Wednesday. Actually, Thursday is better for me. Delay. At this point, because of that railway spur that's been extended, and now the occupation of Hungary, the Jews of Hungary are being sent and deported to Auschwitz at a rate now of 12 to 15,000 a day. And yet the London and Washington are sort of umming and ahhing and dithering, and they don't do anything. And historians will debate till the end of time exactly why not and who's to blame and so on.
But they're winning the war, so as you say,
the priority is winning the war.
Yeah.
The priority is winning the war, and I think that's a completely legitimate line of defence, that we had to first defend the war. I think the counter argument is it would have been almost no diversion from the war effort at all. I mean, they were bombing sites 3 or 4 kilometres from Auschwitz, industrial sites. It would have required the work of 30 seconds to just divert a tiny bit and drop a bomb on those railway tracks. So I don't. That's my reading of it. There are other historians who take a different view, but the point is they don't act on it, even though Churchill gives that direct order. The people who run the Air Ministry and the Air Force say no, and it doesn't go any further. But as you say, it does also make its way to the leader of the Hungarian Jewish community, a man called Rezső Kastner. And this, remember, was the number one focus of Rudy and Fred in escaping, was save the Hungarian Jews. And Rudy's view had always been, you remember, he'd not been obsessed about bombing railway tracks. His thing had been just break through this veil of ignorance. Let them know. If they know, then what awaits them. He didn't have illusions that they would suddenly take up arms, and there were children there, there were old people there. He didn't think that would happen. But he thought there might be panic. If they know that they're about to be gassed to death, they won't line up in orderly columns. They'll panic. There'll be chaos. There'll be a stampede on the railway platform. Good, he thought. Yeah. That it will throw sand in the gears of the SS killing machine. So all you have to do is tell the people. Yeah. Kastner gets this report. He reads it. He doesn't sleep that night on reading it. He's so disturbed by it. He goes to the fellow members of the Jewish Council and says, there's this report from these 2 young men saying that everybody who's deported is gassed in Auschwitz. And they talk about it. The president of the Jewish Council says, well, how do we know this isn't the product of the fevered imagination of 2 rash young men? How can we believe this? In the end, that group and Kastner decide not to pass on the warning to the Jews of Hungary. It goes into a desk drawer of Kastner's, never to be seen by the Jews of Hungary. And
one of history's most ominous desk drawers.
Yeah. That 32-page document sitting in there. In that period, 437,000 Jews are sent from Hungary, overwhelming majority of them murdered in Auschwitz. And for Rudolf Vrba, that would be it would become an obsession. It would haunt him, that thought of what if his warning had only been passed on. He believed that if Jews of Hungary had known, they would not have got on those trains. And you read the testimony of Hungarian Jews on Jews in that area, including Romania as well, and they say, we did not know. We did not know what awaited us. And for Rudy, that would be a crime in his eyes that he just could never forgive, the failure to pass on that warning. Now, we should say, Kastner has his defenders. There are people who say there was very good reason for him not to pass on the warning. He was involved in his own negotiations with Adolf Eichmann, of the architect of the so-called final solution, for a senior-ranking Nazi. They were engaged in their own negotiations. Kastner's accusers say, yeah, he was involved in his own negotiations. That was to save, as he did, 1,684 Jews that he picked. And the price, say his accusers, including Rudy, was to repress the knowledge that was contained in the Vrba-Wetzlar report. In effect, saving a tiny handful at the expense of 437,000 Jews. That remains a raging debate about Kastner. As I say, there are some people who still defend him, but Rudy was convinced that he'd done a terrible wrong in failing to pass on his report. We should say, though, before we think this is somehow a story of total failure, that the report did carry on its journey and did eventually, and I'm here biased, but thank God, made its way into the hands of a British journalist who published it, made sure it was there in the world's press in late June. I mean, more than 2 months after Rudy and Fred have escaped on April the 10th, 1944. But it did make it there. And the fact that it was suddenly public, and knowledge of Auschwitz was public, meant that the Pope and Franklin Roosevelt, both of whom had the knowledge already and had seen the report had made it to the Vatican and made it to Washington already. But now they know that it's public, and their own, as it were, constituents, the world's Catholics, the American voters, will know that this is happening. They then act. They put huge pressure on the regent Miklos Horthy, the ruler of Hungary, and say, essentially, the FDR says, if we win this war, we're going to hold you accountable for the deportation. He panics, and he orders a halt to the deportation of the Jews from Hungary, the remaining Jews, which are the Jews of Budapest, the capital city. They have not yet got on those trains. And he orders a halt, and the halt happens to the point where a train that is literally on its way to Auschwitz stops and turns back. And at that moment, the 200,000 Jews of Budapest are saved deportation to Auschwitz, thanks to the report by Fred Wetzler and Rudolf Vrba, which is why I say that Vrba is a towering figure of this period who absolutely deserves to be ranked alongside Anne Frank, Oskar Schindler, as the stories that we remember of the Holocaust, even though, as I embarked on this, his name had been all but forgotten.
One of the reasons, maybe, and you mentioned this as well, he's not... when you approach survivors of the Holocaust especially, we as a public sort of expect a saint, someone who's been achieved sainthood through suffering, and we come to expect, like Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. That's I'm not trying to belittle him or anything, but that's sort of a figure that we want. We want someone who has been through the worst, been through hell, and been ennobled by it, and that they can somehow pass on that nobility of their soul to us, and so that if we listen to them and their stories and what they found, and like search for meaning, or small acts of kindness, or something that's forgiving. But Rudolf Vrba doesn't do that, so he doesn't really conform to that expectation, and maybe that's part of the... Very much.
You've put it very eloquently about ennobling through suffering, and this notion of achieving sainthood through suffering. It's quite a Christian idea, actually, and not particularly a Jewish idea. But I think you're absolutely right, and that's the expectation. And even now, if you listen to interviews with Holocaust survivors who are very, very old now, the dynamic is exactly as you describe it, where the interviewer, softly spoken, as if in the presence of greatness, and expecting some of that nobility to rub off on them. And what they are looking for, the interviewer, us, is some kind of consolation, some solace to make us feel better about the world. Because exactly as you say, they've seen the very worst, and yet they've come through it. Maybe that tells us there is hope after all. That's what we want them to say. And I think of the archetypal example of this, to my mind, is someone like Elie Wiesel, who won the Nobel Peace Prize. He was the sort of definitive Holocaust survivor in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Always spoke in this soft, mournful voice. It seemed like the conscience of humanity. Rudolf Vrba was everything but that. He was lively and angry, and had this bizarre smile on his face when he would talk, which Claude Lanzmann says to him, why do you smile through all this? And he says, what, you prefer I should cry? Yeah. He unsettles people who talk to him, chiefly, though, because he points this accusing finger at Kastner, at others in Slovakia, who's Jews, who he felt didn't pass on his warning. He is ready to accuse the people who didn't act on his warning. All the people we think as the good guys in the story, Jews, Churchill, Roosevelt,
other Holocaust survivors.
Survivors.
How did you survive?
Well, this is a big thing where he fell out with Fred Wetzler, his escape partner, because Wetzler married an Auschwitz survivor. You would think that would be some kind of bond between them.
Yeah.
No, on the contrary, Rudy is suspicious of her. How did she survive Auschwitz? He says, as somebody who survived Auschwitz, she must have had to have done something, some moral compromise. I mean, amazing thing to have that as his response.
Yeah.
So he's a difficult guy, and he knows it. And I found this letter, which I really, I read it, I held it in my hands and read it twice over, thinking this is so telling. A BBC documentary producer wanted him to come on a TV show and talk about his experiences, and Rudy said, "I must warn you, I am not your cliched Holocaust survivor." What an amazing thing to say, that to say there is such a thing as a cliched Holocaust survivor.
Yeah, he saw that even. I mean, it might be clearer now, perhaps.
Yeah.
But at that time, it's very clear-eyed and very. What would you say? No bullshit attitude.
Yeah, and it's it's very taboo breaking to talk like that. He wasn't interested in all the kind of reverence and solemnity. What he was interested in was anger. He was angry, and I don't think, just this as a general point, and maybe it's addressed to people like you and me in the media, but when we speak to or encounter people who are victims of great trauma, I don't think we necessarily give them the space to be angry. We expect them to be forgiving, ennobled, as you say, saintly. And, he lived in Vancouver the last 30 years of his life. He was a scientist, taught biochemistry at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And in Vancouver, which has a very small Jewish community, really, every year they would organize a symposium for high school students on the Holocaust, and they would have a panel of survivors. I don't know how many they had to choose from in Vancouver, but it wouldn't have been a huge field. And however many they had, I can say with certainty, they didn't have anyone who had as much of a story to tell as Rudolf Vrba, but they didn't invite him. No. And I spoke to the man who organized that, and I said, why did you not include Rudolf Vrba? And he said, because if you asked Rudolf Vrba to speak, you didn't know how long it would be before he would descend into accusations and rage. Yeah. And high school students didn't want a Holocaust survivor who's going to start raising his voice and pointing the finger and shouting. He spoke once to the Jewish community of Vancouver, and people who were there said at some point during the speech, it seemed to change, where he was no longer talking about the Jewish community of Vancouver. He was now talking about the Jewish communities of Slovakia, and he was sort of merging them, accusing them all of failing to do enough. And so after a while it became, when people would look at the list of potential guests, you think, maybe not. No. And that happens long enough, over decades and decades and decades. Eventually you get forgotten. Yeah. And I think the very best chroniclers of the Holocaust knew how important he was. So Claude Lanzmann seeks him out for his film. Sir Martin Gilbert, the late Martin Gilbert, historian, he sought him out for his books. One or two others. But otherwise, he was quietly dropped from the historical record because he was not conforming to the script. And I hope if one thing is achieved by my book, it is that his rightful place is restored, because now he's not around. Most of the other survivors are not around. The people who were offended by what he used to say, then it's not a matter of living reputations anymore. Now it's in the realm of history, and therefore I hope he can have granted to him the place in history that he surely merits.
Yeah, and he's one of the disconcerting things. Maybe it's because I've turned 40, but you feel like you're the main character of a movie when you're young, and especially nowadays when you can have like a soundtrack from Spotify in your ears while you're walking through town, and you can pretend that you're Bruce Wayne walking through Gotham City while you're just walking to 7-Eleven to buy a piece of bread, and this story. You have, it's very easy to, he is so obviously a main character, driving a story and saving people and forcing the hand of others who don't want to act. He's so... but then you realize when you read this, he is so extraordinary that the likelihood that you yourself is Rudolf Vrba is so vanishingly small.
Yeah.
Especially as a Swede, I'm very good at queuing. We are very good at queuing in Sweden. I'm much more inclined now. And also when you have kids, you don't want to risk them, so you always have like incentives to be well behaved. So I mean, if you would have written this book 25 years ago and I would have read it, I don't think I would have made this because I had no kids, I was young. But now I feel like it's the adventure is there, but it's also like who am I in this story? I'm the lamb. I would say, or maybe I'm also maybe the Nazi or somebody driving the train. But there are very few Rudolf Verbas around.
You are completely right about that. That we want the fantasies that we'd all be that hero, and actually, if you're thinking clear-eyed and realistically and honestly, the chances are overwhelmingly that we would not be. But you put your finger on one very important thing when you mentioned having children, and I make a point throughout the book of, and a reader spotted it before I had, of how often I mention his age and how young he is. Because it's central to my mind, the fact that he was a young man is so important, because the minute you have children, dependents on you who you have to look after, suddenly it's the idea of taking risks becomes much, much harder, because you've got other people who will pay a price as well as you. And he understood that about himself. In later life, in his second marriage, he and his second wife did not have children. And one of the explanations he gave his wife is that he had children with his first wife, and he realized how vulnerable they made him. He understood, I think, that once you have children, you are vulnerable, you can't take risks, you've got something to lose. And as an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, he really didn't. He was able to risk everything. And here enters into the story a Swede. So in Hungary was a man called Georgi Klein, who would later flee to Sweden and become Georg Klein, an eminent scientist in this country. But age 19, another 19-year-old in the story, he was working in the Jewish Council in Hungary as a very junior official. The body effectively headed up by Raju Kastner, and he was shown a copy of the report out of the desk drawer. A rabbi who he worked for said, "I'm going to show you this, and then once you've seen it, you can't tell anybody about it, apart from immediate family and friends, but no one else." And he showed him the report, and Georg Klein, as he then was, Georgi Klein, Hungarian then, immediately went to tell his uncle, older than him. And the uncle was so angry with him, he almost threatened to hit him. "How can you say such things? This isn't true. I can't believe that. You don't start spreading panic." And he then told another relative who had a similar reaction. But when he noticed a pattern. When he told young people, they made a plan to escape. They believed it, they made a plan to escape. When he told older people who had a business, who had property, who had children, who had elderly parents, they couldn't hear it. Because the idea of having to give up everything and flee, it was too difficult. Yeah. So there is something in that. And Georg Klein would then flee Hungary and did survive the Holocaust and made his way to Sweden and lived a very full and productive life here. And then late in life, he saw the film Shoah, he saw Rudolf Vrba talking and realized that must have been the man who wrote the report I saw in the desk drawer. And he made a journey to Vancouver to meet him and thank him. And there's a fascinating encounter between the two men, late in life, now old, one saying to the other, "You saved my life." But the crucial point is, and in fact, they talked about it, and Vrba said to him, how angry he was that the report wasn't passed on. And Georg Klein said to him, please don't be angry. Learn from what happened to me. Apart from the young, no one would have believed it. I can tell you that. Take it on trust from me. I tried. When people heard that warning, they didn't want to hear it. He was saying that to try and comfort Vrba. But it didn't work.
No, I wouldn't imagine it would.
Yeah.
I just want to, I mean, this story is, we're not going to talk long about it because I've taken much of your time, but of course we're speaking now on Tuesday 24th, so it's been a little over 2 weeks since Hamas attack on Israel, and we're also sitting in the Holocaust Museum here in Stockholm, recently opened, and but we have in Sweden we've had lots of problems with anti-Semitism, especially most famously in the south, in Malmö. But like it was the attack on the 7th of October. It's been said it's the most deadliest massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust. Of course, it's not comparable in scale, but the gruesome details, and I mean, I'm not really sure what I want to ask you, but we often talk about learning from history, and you sound, at least I used to think that I sounded smart when I said that, but I don't know what it means really. So what is the takeaway here, or is it just too much of an ongoing situation to have any takeaways?
It is hard to, because we are still reeling from it. And when I say we, I think everyone, but I do also particularly mean Jews around the world. It's the event that was not meant to happen after the creation of Israel. Jews knew there would always be anti-Semitism, there'd be attacks. But those hours when Jews were undefended in their own homes, suffering the most heinous, sadistic, cruel kind of violence, tortured when they were alive, mutilated once they were dead. These sit very deep in the Jewish memory. They predate, really, as memory, the Holocaust. This is what pogroms were like. And certainly for those few hours, and there will be questions asked in Israel, and already are being asked, about where the army was and why it took so long to come. But that has stirred a very sort of deeply painful memory for Jews, seeing that happen. Obviously, since then, there has been Israel's response, both in terms of the blockade of essential food and water, electricity, medicine, and the airstrikes, which are exacting a very, very heavy pain on the Palestinians in Gaza. So watching all this from afar it has been gruesome. And, you know, I noticed that Jews just informally saying to me that it has felt, they talk about it as if it's like seeing each other feels like visiting a Shiva house, as if we're all collectively in mourning. Shiva being the 7-day period when Jews are in mourning after a family death, you know. But in terms of the historical point, and I hadn't thought of this until you said it, the phrase that was said after the Holocaust about learning the lessons from history. So the 2-word soundbite that comes out of the Shoah is never again.
Yeah.
The problem with that as a phrase is it means very different things to different people. For some people, it means never again will the Jews be vulnerable to attack without the ability to defend themselves. Never again will anyone send them into the abattoir like sheep. And therefore that means...
Not like... there's a new book in Sweden. It's called Not Like Lambs for the Slaughter, and it's about actual Jewish resistance during the second... So that's basically never again lambs sent like... Yeah.
And we've talked in our conversation today about how the sheep-like thing isn't to disparage the the Jewish victims. On the contrary, it just says that they were deceived so systematically that they had no idea what awaited them. So one lesson is never again will Jews be in that position, and that leads to the view that says Israel will have to do militarily whatever is required to defeat this murderous enemy. And if that means eradicating Hamas, and pulling it out from the roots, it will do that no matter what the world says, no matter how scandalized, commentators are. That's one lesson. Then there is another view that says the never again is never again must any people inflict pain and suffering on another people, and sometimes this adds to it, you, the Jews of all people, should know that better than anyone. And therefore, how can you, of all people, who have been through, referring back to what you said before, the ennobling experience of suffering, how can you inflict this pain on your neighbours? And perhaps it won't surprise you to know that I think any sort of conscious human being and any conscious Jewish person moves between these two never again. Yeah. They live, both of them, within me. To be a Jew in the 21st century is to sort of walk this tightrope between these two never agains, and to think it's true that if you have absorbed really, not even just the Jewish experience, but the human experience of the 20th century, your heart breaks at the idea of a whole population encircled and besieged in Gaza, deprived of the basics of life, and having bombs rain on them night after night. You have that in your heart. And simultaneously you have in your heart the thought that Jews cannot, because we've done it and we're not doing it again, not have a place of our own that we can defend. And a refuge, and it has to be defended. And if there are people who are willing to come across and murder babies and children and the elderly and rape teenage girls at a music concert, you have to inflict whatever military might is required to disarm that threat. And I can't hear only one of those two things. I find myself pulled by both of them, and that's why what we're going through now is it's awful on every angle. It's awful for everyone involved. It's just horror upon horror.
Thank you, Jonathan Freedland, for being part of Rak Höger.
Thank you for having me.
Och stort tack till er som lyssnar. Och detta är alltså en del av en större publikation på Substack med samma namn som podden, och du hittar alltihop på www.enrakhöger.se. Och har ni några frågor eller synpunkter så tveka inte att höra av er på ivararpi@substack.com. Vi hörs om en vecka igen.